Out of the several confessions of the Reformed churches, one was to be framed common to them all, in which general confession diverse points might be omitted, the knowledge of which is not needful to our everlasting happiness, among which the controversy moved by Piscator and several other subtle opinions broached by Van Arman, footnote Arminius, about free will, the saints' perseverance, and predestination were to be reckoned. The second thing proposed was to avoid contentions about ceremonies and church government, a difference in these respects not hindering our agreement in the same faith and doctrine, or our cordial embracing each other as true believers and joint members of one and the same body. The third thing proposed was to waive the points in debate between the Reformed and the Lutherans, and for this end to model their agreement after the concord of the Polish churches made at Sandomir in the year 1570. It was proposed that the deputies from the Reformed churches would close their deliberations on this plan after a most religious fast with the celebration of the Lord's Supper, wherein the pastors from England and the other nations would all communicate together. This plan for Protestant union did not only contemplate the reciprocation of ministerial and Christian fellowship in the several churches, for that had been in regular practice among Protestants all along. It went much farther, even to the organization of the whole Protestant interest in a public federative union, even of the component churches, however, retaining its own independence and internal order. It was Calvin's plan renewed or prosecuted. It may be further observed that the activity of the French churches in promoting this plan furnished no proof of their having declined from their soundness in the faith or their zeal in maintaining it, for in 1617, in their General Synod of Vitré, appointed commissioners to attend the Synod of Dort for the purpose of deciding on the several points of the Arminian controversy, and at their General Synod held at Alès in 1620, they unanimously approved the articles agreed upon at Dort, and ordered them to be sworn and subscribed by the pastors and elders of their churches, and by the doctors and professors of their universities. How cordially they could have taken to their bosom the very persons against whose errors they raised the voice of their testimony, provided these errors subverted not the foundation of their faith, is shown by an act of the Second Synod of Chartentin in 1631, in favor of the Lutheran brethren, declaring that, as the churches of the Confession of Augsburgh do agree with the other Reformed churches in the principal and fundamental points of the true religion, and as there is neither superstition nor idolatry in their worship, the faithful of the said confession, who, with a spirit of love and peaceableness, do join themselves to the communion of our churches in this kingdom, may be, without any abjuration at all made by them, admitted to the Lord's table with us, and, as sureties, may present children to baptism, they promising the consistory that they will never solicit these children either directly or indirectly to transgress the doctrine believed and professed in our churches, but will be content to educate them in those points and articles in which both we and the Lutherans are unanimously agreed. Rufus. You have observed that this plan for Protestant communion did not only contemplate the reciprocation of ministerial and Christian fellowship in the several churches, for that had been in regular practice among Protestants all along. This is true. These churches had all separated from the Popish Church. They agreed in their testimony against the errors and corruptions of that church. Their attention was engaged, and their hearts endeared to one another by the common cause. Hence they communicated together without scruple. Considering the local situations of these churches, the little communication they had at first with one another, and the variety of their means of information, it was no wonder that there were remarkable differences of opinion and practice. It was indeed owing to a remarkable measure of the presence and Spirit of God with them that they attained the harmony of doctrine which is so conspicuous in their confessions. While this harmony continued, there was no occasion for the Catholic communion now pleaded for. But differences soon began to appear, which, unless they were removed, they were sensible would interrupt their communion, for they could not walk together except they were agreed. The removal of their differences seemed to have been the object of the several proposals of union which you have mentioned. Sometimes a difference may arise from a misunderstanding of a doctrine or practice, and may be removed by a more particular explication. Sometimes it arises from real error held by one church in opposition to a scriptural truth proposed by another church. The difference last mentioned cannot be removed without a renunciation of the error. In these two ways, such men as Calvin honestly labored to bring churches and their members to union. But others, led by carnal policy, having attempted to bring churches and their members to a pretended union, which consisted in an agreement to differ, and to acquiesce in a general and deceitful way of expressing a doctrine that had been controverted, declining the plain and honest expression of it that had been used in the public profession of one or another of the parties. This indeed is the plan of your scheme of Catholic communion, but it is dealing deceitfully in the matters of God. The pretended healing of divisions in this way is a healing of the wound of God's people slightly, saying peace, peace, while there is no peace. Of this kind the proposal seems to have been, which you mentioned, of union among the churches in the way of conniving at superstitious ceremonies and prelatical church government. It is not unlike the kingcraft of James I, but suits ill with the excellent character of the Reformed Church of France at that time. For what end were these churches to unite? If it was not for maintaining such evangelical truths as those denied by the Arminians and by Piscator? The churches of France had, some years before the date of this proposal, justly condemned the peculiar opinion of Piscator concerning the active obedience of Christ, and in their national assembly at Rochelle had asserted in opposition to Piscator's error that the whole obedience of Christ, both in his life and death, is imputed to us for our justification before God. But how their approving the canons of the Synod of Dort, and appointing them to be sworn and subscribed by the pastors and elders of their churches, could consist with a proposal of admitting to their sacramental communion those whom these canons condemn as gross heretics, I confess, I do not understand. At the General Synod, held at Tonines, the outlines of this plan of union are said to have been drawn. It is not said, however, that the Synod approved these outlines, but if they did approve them, they retracted their approbation a few years afterwards, when they solemnly adopted the Articles of the Synod of Dort. There is indeed no reason to doubt that the Reformed churches of France understood better after the Synod of Dort how diametrically opposite the opinions broached by Van Arman were to the doctrine of their confession than they had done before. Considering that the Arminian scheme includes some of the most pernicious errors of Popery, how reproachful is it to the memory of Calvin to call such a base proposal his plan revived and prosecuted? Did Mr. Calvin ever speak of independent churches in one Church of Christ, or of promoting union by holding sacramental communion with the professed teachers of false doctrine, as every Arminian teacher is, or with the professed defenders of the superstition in the worship of God? By no means. With regard to the attempts that were made to bring about union with the Lutheran churches, that is, with such of them as had not adopted the form of concord published in 1577, nor gone into the extremes of the ubiquitarians, there seems to be no difficulty, since none of the articles of the Augsburgh Confession had been condemned by any of the Reformed churches. On this account, the act of the Synod at Charenton in favor of the Lutheran brethren cannot be considered as a precedent for the motley communion now pleaded for, and also because the conditions of church communion stated in that act are such as no avowed or obstinate enemy to any one article of the Confession of the Reformed Church of France could acquiesce in without the grossest inconsistency. Alex, if from France we pass to Holland, we shall there find the same generous feeling towards all the parts of the Church of God. The Belgic Confession, which shows in what light the Church there contemplated the privilege and duty of church communion, received the unqualified approbation of the continental divines at the Synod of Dort in 1618, and it received also, with the exception of its articles on church government, the approbation of the episcopal divines who were sent thither by James I. Here was a collection of representatives of the Reformed churches, various in their modifications of order and rites of worship, yet one in the common faith of the gospel, Dutch, German, Genoese, Swiss, all non-episcopal, with an English bishop and other episcopal delegates, met together to discuss one of the most serious controversies that ever agitated the Church of God, and united in the most solemn acts of ministerial communion. Dr. Joseph Hall, then Dean of Worcester, and afterwards Bishop of Norwich, delivered a sermon in Latin before the Synod, in which he salutes the Church of Holland as the pure spouse of Christ. From these arrangements it appears that the Reformed churches, episcopal and non-episcopal, did not scruple in those days to join with each other in acts of public worship, according to their respective usages, much less did any of them look upon any other as not being true churches, and upon their ministry and ordinances as unlawful and invalid. Such a notion concerning churches without episcopal order and ordination had not yet infected the Church of England. Her representatives at Dort called the ministers of the Dutch Church beloved brethren and fellow ministers. The views and feelings of Dr. Hall corresponded entirely with those of the whole synod, for they called his discourse most learned and accurate, and gave him public thanks for it. So that, considering how the synod was constituted, it may be taken as an official expression of the views and feelings of Reformed Europe. At the close of the synod, the members mutually gave each other the right hand of fellowship and parted with embracings and tears. As to the Church of Holland, it is well known that she practiced the liberal communion of which those illustrious deputies sanctioned the principle and set an example. For her members before that communicated with the Brownists, the English independents, who fled from oppositions in their own country, although by a singular inconsistency the Brownist teachers would not consent to reciprocate the communion any farther than in prayer and hearing the word, and that in the face of their own protestation, wherein they say, "We account the Reformed churches as true and genuine. We profess communion with Reformed churches. We profess communion with them in the sacred things of God, and as much as in us lies, we cultivate it. An inconsistency which it is heartily to be wished had stood alone and had not been kept in countenance by the profession and practice of later days, but which at the time was equalled only by the inconsistency of the English government in supporting the non-episcopal churches abroad and persecuting the very same sort of churches at home. The Church of Holland was ready to communicate in the sacraments with the English dissenters as well as with the establishment, and actually appointed one of the former, the learned and excellent Dr. William Ames, professor of theology in the University of Frankfurt. In the like manner, 30 years afterward, in 1651, that holy man of God, Samuel Rutherford of St. Andrews in Scotland, was invited to the professor's chair in the city of Utrecht. In fact, the churches of Holland and Scotland, like the Reformed churches on the continent, considered and treated each other as parts of a common whole, and furnished by their connection and intercourse, as they had opportunity, a sample of Catholic communion to which the obligation is so clearly asserted in their confessions. Rufus, I have no doubt that the Belgic Confession receives the unqualified approbation of the continental divines, this being a native consequence of what has been stated concerning the harmony of the confessions of the Reformed churches. Their sacramental communion upon this ground, as we have seen, was no example for the Catholic sacramental communion now contended for. There was indeed a greater appearance of such an example in the communion of these churches with the bishop and other members of the Church of England. I do not say I approve of this communion absolutely, or in all respects, but though the Reformed churches in France, in Germany, and in Holland disliked the episcopacy of the Church of England, none of them had ever stated a formal separation from that church, and she had not stated a formal separation from them. They know that the first reformers in England, such as Cranmer, Jewel, and others, spoke of the identity of the office of bishop and presbyter and humanly devised rites and ceremonies as no part of religious worship, much in the same terms with those which are used concerning them in confessions in the other Reformed churches. And they still had hopes that the Church of England would go forward in Reformation. In short, while the Church had not stated in opposition to the profession of the Reformed churches, yet these churches while the Church had not stated any opposition to the profession of the Reformed churches, nor these churches any opposition to her profession, their sacramental communion with her was no example of the Catholic communion now pleaded for. It is plain that there having nothing at this time to hinder the Church of Scotland from having sacramental communion with any of the Reformed churches excepting the Church of England, as nothing had been stated in her public profession in opposition to any other of them, nor in the public profession of these other churches in opposition to her. You observe that while the members of the Church of Holland communicated with the Brownist teachers, these teachers, by singular inconsistency, would not consent to reciprocate the communion any farther than in prayer and hearing the word, and that in the face of Robinson's protestation, in which he declared that they accounted the Reformed churches as true and genuine, and that they professed communion with them in the sacred things of God. But you forgot to add, what aggravates the inconsistency of the Brownists, but serves at the same time to show that the conduct of the Church of Holland in communicating with them was no example of the Catholic communion now contended for, that Robinson also declared the adherence of the Brownists or Congregationalists to the confessions of the Reformed churches in this very solemn manner. We profess before God and men We so agree with the Reformed Church of Holland that we are willing to subscribe all and each of the articles of faith of these churches as are contained in the harmony of the confessions of faith.